hands, face, space. What about stay home, save lives, protect the NHS? The government worked very hard during the COVID pandemic on making sure its messaging resonated with the public.
But was that messaging perhaps too successful? As we emerge from the pandemic, is it time for a new public health campaign to ease us back into normal life? Or is that too much of a risk at a time when Omicron infections are as high as ever?
Let's get the view of Professor Marcantonio Spada, Professor of Addictive Behaviours and Mental Health and Dean of the School of Applied Sciences. Marcantonio, talk us through the reasoning behind the government's slogans and how effective they were.
So, hi, Esther. Hi, Philip. I think if the objective was to ensure compliance through fear, they were very effective. The question is whether they were too effective and they've led possibly to the development of anxiety responses that may prove to be problematic over the long term. So we still have to see whether this will be the case. But if we look at data, and I'm thinking of data that's just recently come out from the ONS, we find that a third of adults aged 16 to 24 still report avoiding crowded places, and this rises to almost 70% or 71% for those aged 70 or above. It's a very interesting report. There is also data showing that the levels of masking are still very high. So for me, the main concern is, was the nudging too much? And what will be the residue? What is it that we'll have to face psychologically?
Marcantonio, those figures are really interesting. I see from them 53% of people say they're avoiding crowds, 53% say they're spending more time at home, and 74% said they wore a face covering at some point in the previous 10 days, which I find quite surprising. What do you make of those figures? Did they surprise you?
No, they don't surprise me, because if we look at the levels of psychological distress experienced during the pandemic, and some of the psychological distress will have been linked to the deaths, especially early on in the pandemic, to economic hardship, etc., isolation. Some of the psychological distress will inevitably have been linked to the threat messaging we were exposed to here and abroad, and I'm thinking Italy and other countries in Europe. So if we look at data from March 2021, which I've published recently and discussed in an article, in a news article, the UK had the highest level of psychological distress across 6 countries that were surveyed. That was March 2021. It was around about 2.5 to 3 times higher than pre-pandemic levels, and around about 50 to 70% higher than, for example, in Sweden. So I'm not surprised. There was probably an objective to ensure compliance, but we see, psychological costs that are considerable, and especially in the young. So the young remain, and returning to this report, the young remain particularly negatively affected from a psychological point of view during this pandemic.